I'll start again. Hello everyone, thank you for joining us. This is Anu Hasangri from the Hepatitis B Foundation. Welcome to today's webinar on HBV clinical trials and why they're important. I'm pleased to introduce our speakers. Unfortunately, Dr. Robert Gish, who was going to be speaking at this webinar, is not feeling well today and was unable to join us. But Dr. Moon Chen is here. Dr. Chen is a nationally renowned expert in clinical and cancer health disparities, particularly as they affect Asian American populations. Dr. Chen serves as the UC Davis Comprehensive Cancer Center's Associate Director for Cancer Control, where he heads research into the determinants of human cancer risk and their mitigation. Dr. Gish is a world-renowned expert on liver diseases and is adjunct professor of clinical medicine at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, and a professor consultant at Stanford University in California. Dr. Gish also serves as the medical director of the Hepatitis B Foundation in Doylestown. Well, today, because Dr. Gish is not able to join us, I and Dr. Chen will be presenting his slides, and then I'll hand it over to Dr. Chen afterwards to present his own slides. After the presentations, you are welcome to send in your questions and comments. You can use that, sending in your comments and questions using the text box feature. So with that, I'll just continue. Wanted to first talk about what clinical trials are. They're basically studies in which the people volunteer to test new drugs or devices. And we do this to basically learn whether new treatments are working and whether they are safe. So basically efficacy and safety. Now it's important to understand that therapies in clinical trials are not the same as available drugs, which is what you get for routine care. Available therapies have been tested and approved. So why are clinical trials so important? Well, new treatments have to pass many tests before they can get to patients. And using clinical trials, we can advance science and help others. There are other considerations too. It's very often patients will be able to get access to therapies in development which are not available yet on the market. Tests, treatments, and medicines usually are free for the study volunteers. And patients may be observed more closely during a trial. So what do healthcare providers do in clinical trials? Well, clinical trials involve a team of individuals, and including, of course, the study volunteer. On the healthcare provider side, you have physicians. It's usually the principal investigator. They organize and direct the study and review the data. The clinical research coordinator is also an important member of the clinical trial team. The clinical research coordinator handles the day-to-day activities and is the main contact for the study volunteers or patients who take part in the trials. So how do we find clinical trials, and especially those related to HBV or hepatitis B? Well, you can go on clinicaltrials.gov, and that's a very comprehensive list, but it lists all clinical trials, and to navigate the clinicaltrials.gov website can be a little bit daunting. You can also find hepatitis B-related clinical trials on the Hepatitis B Foundation's website. That's hepb.org. You can go also find information on our website or contact info@hepb.org or call 215-489-4900. We have an updated list of HBV-specific trials, and if you can see here, it provides also contact information for the trial site so that you can contact the research team. The clinical trials on the website are listed according to various categories, for example, HBV in pregnant women, those who have liver cancer, for pediatric cancer, pediatric patients, and hepatitis D. In addition, local academic and non-academic institutions and pharma companies also list clinical trials on their website, so you can search through that. The Hepatitis B Foundation also has a drug watch where you can see on our website the therapies, hepatitis B therapies that are in development, and so you can track that and see if they are running clinical trials that you can enroll in. Another organization that would be very important for people interested in clinical trials is the Center for Information and Study on Clinical Research Participation, or CISRIP. They have a free service that you can use by calling 1-877-MED-HERO or going on their website, cisrip.org, and they will help you do a personalized search for appropriate trials that are either in your area or to further away, any distance that you wish to travel. You send them your contact information, and then they will send you specific information about research studies that you might be eligible for or interested in. If you ask for the information to be sent by email, it takes about a week. And if you ask for regular mail, they'll take 2 weeks to send you the information. They also provide a free educational brochure which includes questions that you can ask research staff. And they also have that CenterWatch clinical trials database. If you enter this on their website, you can actually search for specific trials yourself. So, Dr. Chen, I would maybe hand this over to you now, since you're so involved with clinical trial participation. Perhaps you can run through how healthcare providers get involved in a trial.
Okay, thank you very much, Anu. And I wondered if someone could just tell me, shout out, how many in the audience are healthcare providers?
Dr. Chen, the audience is muted.
Okay, okay. So, so let me just share with you the research on this. The principal determinant on whether or not people get involved in a clinical trial is whether their provider recommends it. And so, so we want to encourage all the healthcare providers to get involved in clinical trials, especially those relevant to Hep B. And so, what I'd like to do is that we want you to, I think the easiest way to do it is just let Anu and Hep B Foundation know that of your interest, and then we can try and connect you with the available clinical trials, because you have specialized populations that would benefit from the clinical trials. The next, please. So if you're not involved, again, you know, Hep B Foundation has this database that can identify where the trials are that you could participate on, and then transfer the records. Everybody will still be involved in care, and in California, and this varies by state to state, all the clinical trials are covered financially, so there is no additional cost to the patient for participating in clinical trials. Let's go to the next slide, which have to do with barriers. This is coming from the provider's perspective. The barriers include the fact that these trials can last a long time, and so you need to allocate staff and budget and time to balance the business aspects. But it is rewarding to the patient and to the provider for that purpose. Next slide. Other barriers to clinical trials include the fact that you may not be aware of the new trials and drugs, and then also the lack of urgency for patient-centered trials. But let me just say, all the research indicates that patients on clinical trials get just as good or even better care than if they were not on clinical trials, and that while there are costs, at least in some states, they're covered by insurance or by other mandates. Next slide, please. So here are some concerns that have been expressed by healthcare providers. Patients who may not want to participate they may not be willing to participate by protocol because of language, culture, because of time, and because of the sense that you might lose patients. But this is all part of the advancement of science. If it weren't for clinical trials are the main way in which we achieve advances in therapy. Let's go to the next slide. So, so what are the key messages for healthcare providers about Hep B related clinical trials? The first step is for you all to test for Hep B in all at-risk patients. These include people who are born in the CDC-defined endemic areas, lots of parts of East Asia, parts of Africa, Alaska. Testing for anti-HPC, and if they are positive, we don't need to vaccinate, but we can educate about the risk of reactivation, and then offer vaccination if all 3 Hep B tests are negative. And this is the wonderful thing about Hep B, is that there is a vaccine preventable thing. So, so the key messages for patients about clinical trials is, while we don't have a cure for Hep B infection, and that there are lifelong treatments that can work, and that these new drugs could be simpler, require shorter time, and greater effectiveness that could prevent or avoid Hep B-related death, liver transplants, and liver cancer. Next, please. Okay, so we want to ask you to talk to your patients about clinical trials, especially if they're chronically infected with Hep B, and that face-to-face meetings are better than telephone discussions, and then to use many of the materials that are available through Hep B Foundation. And Dr. Gish is pretty much involved in this World Health Organization plan to eliminate Hep B worldwide by the year 2030, and that there are many new therapies that are in development to result in a functional cure. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is what I want to focus in on, is what your roles as providers and patient advocates in increasing Asian American participation in clinical trials. And let me just say, the reason why that's important is that Asian Americans, even though we're about 6% of the nation's population, we have 50% of the Hep B factors. So let me share with you my 3 objectives. First of all, I want to review the facts about Hep B. I want to talk about our responsibilities, and then finally our roles. Next slide, please. So, next slide. Next slide, please. The first fact I want us to remember and review is that the profile of Asian American cancer deaths are different than NHW, which means non-Hispanic whites. And what I've displayed for you, first of all, is the rank order, before we go there, the rank order of lung cancer, of cancer deaths. And what I want you to observe is that you see that in both non-Hispanic white men and women, liver cancer is not among the top 5. However, if you look now at the next panel, which is Chinese, you will notice that liver cancer is the 2nd most common cause of cancer death for Chinese. Next slide, please. You'll see that liver, next slide, please, that liver cancer is also the 4th leading cause of cancer death for Filipinos. It is not a major cause of death for Japanese, but for Koreans, liver cancer is 3rd most prevalent cause of cancer deaths in Korean men, 5th in Korean women. And next slide there, I want you to highlight the fact that liver cancer is the 2nd most common cause of cancer death among Vietnamese men, and the 4th among Vietnamese women. So the point of this is just the fact that that Asian Americans are disproportionately represented in the prevalence of chronic hepatitis B, and this is a particularly important reason why Asian Americans need to be involved. Next slide, please. Okay, so just a kind of a very simple message for you for elevator speech that again on the importance of the cancer burden affecting Asian Americans. The first U is the fact that our cancer burden is unique because among all the racial ethnic groups in the United States, Asian Americans were the first to experience cancer as a leading cause of death. In everybody else, non-Hispanic whites and so forth, heart disease is a leading cause of death. Only in 2012 has cancer becoming the leading cause of death for Hispanics and now in some American Indian tribes. So the point is that Asian Americans are unique in that cancer burden. Our cancer burden is also unusual in the sense that while most Americans experience cancers of chronic origin, such as lung cancer, breast cancer, or colon cancer, our cancers that disproportionately affect us are those due to infectious forms of cancer, such as liver cancer, which is spread by a virus, cervical cancer spread by a virus, stomach cancer by a bacteria. Thirdly, then, next slide. Here, the slide here I want to show you is the fact that in fact, among men, all populations of color are disproportionately affected by liver cancer. You can see that Asian, Pacific Islanders, American Indian, Alaska Natives, Hispanics, and blacks all suffer higher mortality rates than whites. The next slide, please. It shows the same situation for females, although in this case, American Indian, Alaska Native women lead all liver cancer deaths, but the picture is the same in the sense that all populations of color are disproportionately affected by liver cancer. Next slide, please. So the third U, unique, unusual, is the fact that it's unnecessary. And this cancer burden is unnecessary because prevention is available, it's better than a cure, and earlier detection can help reduce the risk of liver cancer. So that early detection I'm talking about is the screening for hepatitis B, and then if you're not naturally immune and you're not chronically infected, vaccination is the way to go to actually prevent hepatitis B related liver cancer. Next slide, please. So now I want to talk about our responsibilities. Next slide, please. And I want to just share with you some of the progress and future. Next slide, please. This is some research that we have done, and these lines refer to survival rates. And the horizontal axis refers to weeks, and what this graph shows you is that all Asian American populations do not have a long survival rate, and that among all Asian Americans, the group that has the shortest survival is the Laotian Hmong. And it's just in a matter of weeks as opposed to years. Next slide, please. And so what are some things that we can do? Well, screening. And I know that many people in the Hepatitis B task force are involved in screening. This is one of the screening efforts that we do, the 1,000 Asian American studies. And you can see the fact that we include counseling, we have to have bilingual, bicultural staff, and that we go through the screening and other processes. Next slide, please. The nice thing about this is that what we need to focus on is two prongs. One prong is the adults, and if you're older than, let's say, 25 years old, that's the population we need to screen. But if you're younger than 25 or younger, it's very likely that if you're born in the United States, that you were vaccinated as an infant to get vaccinated. So we're talking about sparing the next generation from Hep B. Next slide, please. Okay, so now I want to have Anu show you a short videotape about clinical trials. So take it away, Anu.
Yep.
Like most Americans, these children will likely live a long and happy life. And although most Americans will die from heart disease, chances are these kids will not, because the #1 cause of death for Asian Americans is cancer.
Today we know a lot about cancer. Normal cells typically grow, divide, and die, but sometimes they don't.
Sometimes cells just keep growing uncontrollably. They form a tumor, and the cells from the tumor attack other parts of the body. That's cancer.
First of all, cancer is a disease of many different types, and it affects people differently. We need research to help us find the best treatments for each type of cancer. And that type of research is called clinical trials.
Not only do clinical trials benefit cancer patients who participate in the trial, but they can benefit the next generation by leading to discoveries that can help your children and your children's children live their lives without cancer.
We really need Asian Americans to participate in the clinical trials. The only path to better therapies and cures is through the clinical trial process. And it takes us working together to accomplish this.
Today, the need for finding specific treatments for Asian Americans has never been greater.
I just can send them out of patients.
In fact, most leading medications for cancer have been developed through clinical trials. But in order to develop the most effective treatments for Asian Americans, Asian American cancer patients must take part in clinical trials.
America is a melting pot. So we have immigrants, and especially the East Asian immigrants, has been increased over the past few decades. And currently in the clinical trial, we do know that that's the only way we'll advance the cancer care. And Asian Americans are currently underrepresented in the clinical trial patient population.
Being part of a clinical trial is like having an extended family where participants are in a supportive environment with state-of-the-art care.
For Asian cancer survivors, we are very private. And for me, personally, I feel the sense of disappointment and embarrassment to tell my health issues to my parents and family. But after 3 years, I really feel I want to help the community, help myself, my children, the future generation. We have to share the story to try the clinical trials to help to find the cure.
No matter the type of cancer, you should talk to your doctor. Find out if there's a clinical trial right for you.
Finding out that I had liver cancer at my age was a big shock. I had just graduated from school, gotten married, and we were about to start a family. Right away, I knew that I needed to find out what my options were. So I went to talk to my doctor, and he suggested that I participate in a clinical trial. He explained what the possible risks and benefits of that trial would be to me.
When first I talk to my patients about clinical trials, they are always concerned about the quality of care they receive. In fact, they will receive the best standard care possible.
Joining a clinical trial is voluntary. Even after joining, patients have the right to leave the study at any time. All details about a clinical trial are written in a consent form that must be signed. All patient information from a clinical trial is closely protected. Some clinical trials involve additional cost for new drugs. Usually, the trial sponsor and your health insurance will pay the additional cost. Your doctor will welcome any questions you may have about joining a clinical trial.
So not only the patients themselves who can benefit from participating in clinical trial, their children, their relatives, and other patients as well.
It was not an easy decision, but after talking to my doctor and getting all of the information, I decided that participating in the clinical trial It was the best decision for me and for my family.
The surge to find answers for cancer treatment and prevention for Asian Americans is more important than ever. It's the participation from Asian American cancer patients that will open the door to new discoveries for the next generation. Help yourself, help your family for generations to come, and ask your doctor if participating in a clinical trial is right for you.
Okay, so so now we come to the situation, and this is a cartoon of the provider and the patient. And under ideal circumstances, the provider would consider all the factors and decide that a existing and open clinical trial is right for this patient. And so when that occurs, there are questions in the mind of the patient: when, what, how, who, and so forth. So I want to then now in the next slide talk to you about the provider's perspective first, and then I'll talk about the patient's perspective. So the first foundation for the effectiveness of a provider, besides recommending a clinical trial, is the trust factor, that patients have to trust the doctor, and that doctor has to be that trust has to be earned. The next factor is time. Clinical trials explanation requires time, and so the provider must be willing to dedicate an appropriate amount of time to explain what a clinical trial is and its benefits. Next one is the fact that there are tangible benefits for participating, and those tangible benefits are the fact that the care is better or at least just as good without participating in clinical trials. And then beyond the trustworthiness then that has been developed, the final thing is the tools that can be used, and that's more. And the point that I want to make is that while we do have tools that will enable clinicians to increase their effectiveness in encouraging their patients to participate in clinical trials, it really is built upon this pyramid of trust, time, tangible benefits, and trustworthiness. Next slide, please. So now let me talk to you about the patient's perspective. These are some three rings of factors that patients have to consider. The age of the person, the age also in many respects determines the social factors that have to be considered. For example, if the patient is employed, then it may mean making additional accommodations for work, for transportation, for childcare duties, and so forth and so on. Then there are some values to consider. What I'm saying is that we've got to look at it both from the patient's perspective and the provider's perspective, that this is kind of like asking for a long-term relationship, and that from the point of view of the patient, there are many factors to consider in this area. Let's go to the next thing, is how do we increase the efficiency and effectiveness? We have learned from the research that the principal determinant is whether the doctor recommends it. Second factor is whether there is the trust that's earned between the doctor and the patient. Next is the cultural sensitivity, and then the linguistic competence to be able to explain the terms easily. We also have considerable evidence that minorities are quite willing to participate in clinical trials and clinical trials research, but the the basis of everything is trust. Next slide, please. So kind of in review, we wanted to just create the realization that Asian Americans of all the racial ethnic groups have the most to gain from participating in clinical trials. Second of all, in terms of responsibilities, there is a responsibility for the physician to recommend it, and for the patient and the family to consider the benefits of this. This slide here is just to illustrate the fact that we have done considerable research in this area. We have found a very responsive Asian American community to blood biospecimens and to participating in clinical trials. So in summary, here are the 3 R's. If you are a healthcare provider, then your responsibility is to recommend clinical trials to your patient. Second of all, if you have Hep B as a chronic infection, then you need to request that your provider let you know about clinical trials that you may be eligible for and that you will benefit from, as well as benefit from others. And then if you are a family member or the general public, what we want you to do is to, as a result of this webinar, that you know that you are a resource for linking providers and patients to clinical trials. Our next slide, our last slide then, is just a reminder that you can find this information about Hep B clinical trials on clinicaltrials.gov, the Hep B Foundation, and other websites, as well as local and institutions and pharmaceutical companies webinar. That ends our webinar. I'm sorry that Dr. Gish couldn't be on call, but I want to turn it back to Anu, who will handle any questions and discussion.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Chan. That was a great presentation. We do have some questions, and so I wanted to just start off with some of the questions that we've received, and also those that we receive on our helpline as well. The first question is, if I am seeing a primary care doctor for my hepatitis B, can I still take part in a clinical trial? So, for example, can my primary care doctor run the initial tests to see if I'm qualified for a trial, or do I have to see a liver specialist?
No, that's actually the best place to be, is to be under the care of a primary care doctor, and that for your primary care doctor to identify and determine whether or not you're eligible for a particular clinical trial and link you up to those clinical trials. So, so the resources that we've talked about in this webinar, the Hep B Foundation, clinicaltrials.gov, the telephone number, is a great way to link the primary care provider with the pool of eligible Hep B related clinical trials.
Okay.
That was a good question.
Now, if I live far away from a clinical trial site, can I still take part in a trial if I have to have labs run? Do I have to go to the clinical trial center, or can my test results be done locally and sent in?
Yes, well, that's the yes. I know that can be done, and the reason it's done, if you are close to any lab, those lab results can be televised, this telemedicine thing, to your provider. And so that's in fact what we do in Northern California, is we have this video conferencing telemedicine facility, so that you can have your test done locally, but then have your results shared with specialists or providers to interpret the care that you have, and that can be done by telephone or television.
Okay. We have another question here about what is involved with clinical trials. They wanted to know if the paperwork to register for a clinical trial is burdensome, and if a person is not proficient in English, or the health literacy level is low, would they get help from the staff to help register?
Well, I think that's a local situation. I know that first of all hospitals and medical care facilities are required to provide translation services, and so this is no different than any other medical procedure in the provision of medical interpretation.
Okay, We have a question here about someone who wants to participate in a trial, but it says, if I decide to stop taking part in a trial, what happens to my treatment?
Well, first of all, like I think was on the videotape, participation in clinical trial is voluntary. You can quit any time, and the assumption is that if you stop participating in clinical trials, you will continue with the standard of care. So whatever was prescribed or recommended to you in any case, you'll as long as you adhere to that, you will get the same treatment based upon the standard of care. The advantage of a clinical trial is that there may be a therapy that is just as good or better that your situation may respond to.
Okay. Another question related to the treatments in clinical trials. Will some participants in a trial receive placebo?
That is a possibility, not necessarily placebo, but let me just say that typically what happens in a clinical trial is that one is comparing the standard of care versus an alternative. In some situations, the standard of care is no care, so that might be a placebo.
Okay. And then we have a lot of questions. We have a lot of queries from people living outside the United States. But how do I find trials outside the U.S.?
Well, I think this is where one has to start with the World Health Organization and go from there. And the world is divided into different regions, and the World Health Organization regional offices is probably the best advice on that, and they can refer you to whatever resources there are in the host countries.
Okay. Now, Dr. Chen, we, especially at the Hepatitis B Foundation, are getting a lot of questions from people in African countries, as well as African populations here, who are very much affected by hepatitis B. How can we involve more African Americans, especially immigrants, in clinical trials, given their high risk for hepatitis B?
Well, I think among the providers I know, all the providers, especially the specialists who are either hepatologists or infectious disease specialists, are welcoming all patients to participate in clinical trials. And so I think it's just a matter of finding those clinicians and providers who can refer you, and I think that has to be done on a regional and local basis. And so I don't know of anybody who would refuse to serve African American or African patients.
Yeah. I guess that it was more a question of how do we reach those populations and try to inform them and also encourage them to participate in clinical trials.
Yeah, I would refer to an example, Jane Penn in Washington, D.C. She's been very effective in maybe asking Jane on how she does it, because she involves a lot of African American and African serving organizations.
Okay, thank you. And then I guess we just have one other question. If I'm low income and I'm seeing a doctor at a federally qualified health center in the U.S., can I still participate in a trial?
Definitely, if you meet the eligibility requirements for clinical trials. And let me just say what I mean by eligibility requirements. What they're trying to do in a clinical trial is to test whether or not a particular alternative standard of care is just as good or better. And so when we talk about eligibility, we're talking about what we would call inclusion and exclusion requirements. An example of an exclusion requirement is if one is pregnant and we're not sure about the efficacy of the alternative treatment, we may not want to risk the pregnancy to be to be involved. And so that's an example of an exclusion criteria, even though the patient may be positive and otherwise eligible. So the providers and all those involved in clinical trials, they go through inclusion and exclusion requirements to make sure that the trial will be able to achieve the questions on efficacy. And so that is why there may be a list of questions that are asked, even though you may be Hep B positive, to see whether or not this particular trial is right for you.
Okay. Well, I think that comes to the end of all of our questions. I just want to recap the actionable items that you got from this webinar, how to find HBV clinical trials. You can go on clinicaltrials.gov, but that website can be difficult to navigate. The Hepatitis B Foundation has a regularly updated list of HBV clinical trials. And you can go on, you can contact us through info@hepb.org or call the number 215-489-4900. The website, the webpage on clinical trials gives you the contact information for each trial and trial site, so you can call the trial site directly. If you want help searching for clinical trials, you can contact the organization CISRIP at 1-877-MED-HERO or on their website, cisrip.org. They provide information. They take about a week to send it to you if you request it by email, or they can mail it to you. That takes about 2 weeks. They do specific searches according to the criteria that you give them. And then local academic and non-academic institutions list clinical trials on their website, so you can search in that sense. And also pharmaceutical companies list clinical trials on their websites, so that's another way you can find particular clinical trials that may be of interest to you. I want to thank you again, Dr. Chen, for your wonderful presentation and for joining us and for giving us the information about clinical trial participation and how to increase that, and also to information to our community groups, how to talk to patients about clinical trials and talk to providers as well about clinical trial participation and encouraging their patients to consider participating in a clinical trial. Thank you everyone for joining us. I don't see any more questions here. We will be posting this webinar on hepb.org, as well as the website of Hep B United, hepbunited.org. And so you can refer to that webinar for additional information if needed. Thank you again for joining us. This concludes our webinar.
Thank you. Bye-bye.